Okay.
Welcome, everybody, to our Friday Masterclass. It's good to see you all. Today's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to be introducing myself. Usually I do a little introduction of whoever is speaking. So, we'll see how things go, maybe feel a little more casual, perhaps. And I'm also going to try to structure it so that I speak for a while, and then, I'm sort of going to shift, not exactly topics, but shift sections. And then between each section, I'd like to open it up for discussion. So that's how I see us doing it for now. So maybe I will just begin, and then I don't know if there was some ambiguity about whether it was 10 or 10:10, and apparently it said 10 o'clock in the message. So I'm just going to go ahead and start. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit about my background. I think many of you already know quite a bit about what I do, but what? I heard some noise. Oh, well. Okay. So I'm a professor in the religion department, and and also I was the director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, and now I'm the director of the South Asia Institute. Maybe I'll go back to the beginning a little bit and tell you that I got my PhD at the University of Chicago, and I worked with my primary supervisor was McKim Marriott, who is an anthropologist who, got my degree in anthropology, and he was known for creating a very kind of systematic view of something that he called ethno-sociology, which sought to represent Indian thought, and especially Hindu thought, in its own terms, really looking at the underlying assumptions about that are different from Western categories and assumptions, kind of building on the tradition of hermeneutic anthropology that was initiated by Clifford Geertz. And I mention that because that kind of affected, how I was trained. And from a later perspective, in a way, given the shifts in anthropology and in other disciplines, I kind of wish I'd spent more time with another South Asian anthropologist who was also central in the department, although actually, interestingly, a little bit more marginal to the South Asianists at the time, Bernard Cohn, who was basically a historical anthropologist, and the kind of inspiration for thinking about the effects, for example, of colonial practices on categories such as caste. So, and the effects of the census, for example, on kind of rigidifying these categories that had been present, but didn't have the same significance as they did during the colonial era. This was something that, of course, has been picked up by Nick Dirks, who was important at Columbia, and we've mentioned before. And I mention all this because this is the kind of the stuff that I was contending with in terms of my own training, and then watching the discipline change over the subsequent years. And one of the reasons that it was particularly crucial for me to struggle with is that instead of going off to a village where to do field work, where something like the idea of a bounded culture that you just want to understand is, you know, the richness of the conceptual framework that people are operating in terms of. I was in the middle of a city. I worked in Lahore, and I was just bombarded by, you know, different opinions, different ways of understanding the world. And I had few conceptual tools at that point to deal with the basically I hesitate to use the word because it comes up later, but the arguments I saw, you know, I was just, somebody says, oh yeah, this is the way that things work, or this is what that means. And then somebody saying, oh, it means something else. So it's like when you have an idea of culture, static idea of culture, it's like, well, what do you do with that? So after I got back and after I wrote my dissertation, I just kind of tried to represent these different points of view. But again, I wasn't really very satisfied with that. So there was a turn in anthropology well, certainly after I wrote my dissertation, but I'm trying to remember exactly when, but basically the anthropologist Renato Rosaldo and a bunch of others started thinking about culture instead of its being an entity, started to think about cultural processes and the idea that there isn't such a bounded, coherent thing. And really challenging Clifford Geertz's concept of culture. And interestingly, a lot of these challengers were Geertz's students. So I think they were confronting some of the same things that I was confronting, having been trained by Kim Marriott. So the book I ended up writing, which was entirely different from my dissertation, was Arguing Sainthood, which I've asked you to read for today. The full title, Arguing Sainthood, Modernity, Psychoanalysis, and Islam. So the arguing part was how I handled this problem of being in a world where people are arguing all the time. And so I ended up asking instead how people deploy history, how they claim identities and shift positions, and often unbeknownst to themselves. So people sound different when they're talking to different people. So this is some of the stuff that I'll be talking about today. It's a real kind of interdisciplinary framing of what I was trying to do. But I'll tell you a little bit more about, instead of giving my biography in a little instant packet in the beginning, I'm kind of interspersing it with the thought behind it. So in the time between writing the dissertation and writing the book, which was quite a bit of time, I taught in the college at the University of Chicago for several years. I was one of those Harper Mellon Fellows, and then continued. And undertook psychoanalytic training at the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago. So that's where some of the psychoanalytic stuff comes in, and I'm sort of happy to talk, or probably will end up saying a little bit about why I did that and why I did it at that time. But it did, well, maybe I'll say it now. So there were two things. One was the stress of having been off doing fieldwork in an era where there was, you know, of course, no internet. And the only person who could get a letter to me in less than a week was my mother. Somehow she had a hotline, I mean, a sort of a straight line, and her letters came in 5 days. But otherwise it was, you know, this chasm between, you know, my life back in the States and life in Pakistan, and even phone calls. It's probably hard to imagine now, but a phone call involved, I was living in a kind of, I suppose at the time, a lower middle class neighborhood. And the nearest phone that was owned by anybody that the family I was living with knew was like 3.5 blocks away. So if you had to book a call to make it, and if I got a call, then somebody would run from this house and not have to run back. So needless to say, it was a very isolating experience in the sense of being disconnected from my own cultural and social roots. And so that was one reason that getting back to Chicago, doing something like psychoanalysis, my own psychoanalysis, made sense. But also my initial research topic had been thinking about the self and how the self is culturally constructed. So really coming out of Clifford Geertz's work, who also sort of thought about the fact that even what we are as a self is really shaped by these cultural forces. And I ended up doing something quite different with it. But so when I did this psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic training, it ended up really affecting my work. And in that, going back to the time between the dissertation and the book, I wrote a series of articles that struggled with how to bring anthropology and psychoanalysis into conversation without reducing one to the other. So I set aside Freudian explanations of motive. I wasn't concerned with psychoanalyzing individuals or looking for the Oedipus complex or changes in the Oedipus complex in a Pakistani setting or anything like that. And I was and continue to be really dissatisfied with some of those common uses of psychoanalysis to psychoanalyze other cultures. It's a project that to me doesn't make any sense. But at first, anyway, I used methods to learn to listen and how to articulate what I was hearing. Uh-oh, my internet connection is unstable. Can you all hear me? Okay. Okay, so, and one of the ways of thinking about that is that we have this idea, especially in Freudian psychoanalysis, of the unconscious as something that's deep within us, that's invisible, that something that, and I think Freud at some point says, it's not something that can be directly accessed. But this, and as something that Michel Foucault emphasized, this idea of a deep interiority is a construction. It's like, in a sense, it's a metaphor for talking about the complexity of our mental lives. And that and the idea of that inside is very much a kind of a Western understanding of what the self is, that somehow the true self is deep inside, or in this case, the unconscious. And that it's, I think, more accurate in terms of how at least I like to sort of get a sense of what people are doing and what's going on in their interactions with me, is to think of it instead as the idea that we are, well, of course we're complex, that we aren't a unitary self, that we have kind of often conflicting senses of who we are, and that these conflicts are manifest all the time in what we do and what we say. And that I think one of the flaws of anthropological fieldwork has been, and often usually still is, that we tend to collect information, we listen to the content of what people say, and then analyze the words as if they existed in a vacuum apart from the act of utterance, I guess would be a way of putting it. And that instead there are ways of listening where one can examine the act itself. That would be the maybe most direct way of putting it. Okay, so just another little tidbit of biography. Maybe it's too scattered for you to remember it at all, but so I did this psychoanalytic training and then spent nearly 20 years on the faculty at Duke with a primary appointment in cultural anthropology. And then I also had an appointment in the religion department where I was a colleague of Bruce Lawrence, especially Ibrahim Musa, who came in while I was there. And then there was a close working relationship with other universities, UNC and NC State. And so I worked closely with Carl Ernst at UNC, Tony Stewart at NC State. We had this sort of South Asia consortium amongst the universities, which I directed for a while. And so that working relationship was really important, I think, for all of us, and shaped much of what we were doing. I like to think that my anthropological approach shaped, I think Carl Ernst and Bruce Lawrence were very textually oriented when, and I kept pushing them to not think about only authentic Sufis who existed in the past, but to think about the Sufis who, are influenced by sort of Western, New Age religions or diasporic Muslims and that sort of thing. And so this was, I think, a very productive ongoing relationship. And I think they pushed me to think more about the historical roots of the phenomena that I was working on. Okay, so going back to the psychoanalysis for a bit, psychoanalysis taught me to look at conflict and compromise in everything we do in social interaction. It also foregrounds the de-centered nature of the subject of speech. And one of the things I think that sociolinguistics linguists have looked at is the fact that the I, that when you think, I do this, I do that, that I sounds like a stable thing. It's a, but it's what's called a deictic. It references who is speaking, but it says nothing about the speaker. And so the I of this sentence is, different from the I of that sentence. The I in love and the I in rage. And so this is ultimately something that Lacan talks about in his approach to psychoanalysis, which was a really important shift from pure Freudian psychoanalysis, because he does have a more sophisticated understanding of language in many respects than I think than Freud does. And he brought de Saussure's understanding of structural linguistics into psychoanalysis. And that's been, I think, very influential for many, including my own work.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, please feel free to jump in.
When you talk about the I being deictic, is that the word?
Mm-hmm.
So it references who is speaking, but it says nothing about the speaker. It kind of sounds like the I is a floating signifier, like going to like Saussurean linguistics.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very specific category in linguistics, and things like this and that also function in this way, or you. I mean, every time you say you may be referring to somebody different. We tend to think of I as referring to the same thing, but just like you, it shifts. So it's not a floating signifier in the sense of of sort of theories that emphasize the, like Saussure's linguistics that emphasizes the meaning of signs existing in the relationship between two signs, not in the absolute substance of the sign itself. In other words, red has its meaning, the range of the meaning of red is determined by the other color categories that exist within a system of colors. And so they kind of float in relationship to their referent.
But in some ways, like I and you and this and that, they don't even float in relationship to a referent.
Yeah, well, I mean, they do in a certain way. If you have a system, if you think about it, it's sort of how you think about the framework that you're thinking about things in terms of. So that if you're thinking about the framework of pronouns, yes, I means something in relationship to you and he, she, and it. We have this system of pronouns. I refers to the speaker, you refers to the person being addressed, and so on. So in that sense, that they participate in a structure, but from the in a sense, from a psychoanalytic and almost, I guess, Peirce's understanding of how signs work as well, where Charles Sanders Peirce, who is more concerned with the relationship between the speaker and the addressed. The link between I as a signifier and what is being referred to is shifts. It shifts in a way that is. I don't want to make general. I feel like we're sort of going off in a direction that I don't have too many general statements about that are probably going to be inaccurate, but there's a property of these deictics that is different from the properties of other signs that refer to objects rather than referring to speaking situations. So the particular referent changes in a way that is not the case with other kinds of signs. Anyway, so basically the thing I wanted to foreground about it, and I found has been really central for my thinking, is that it really foregrounds psychoanalysis. So I mentioned that it's, that everything is a compromise between everything that actually is uttered is a compromise between these different forces or influences that are coming to bear on the situation. So if you hear me hesitate before choosing a word, and which I often do, as I like to be precise in how I say things, it's because all of these sort of conflicting possibilities that have implications that resonate beyond what we can even imagine are all going into this moment of deciding on a particular word to use or a particular phrase. And I think my explanation of deictics probably encapsulates that. If you sort of, if I think at least of all the other things I could have said about it. So in terms of the decentered nature of the subject, Freud had a way of putting it. He saw the ego. He saw the psyche, and one of his models as being split between the ego, the id, and the superego. We've all heard this. And he had this idea of the ego, which we tend to think of as the the conscious self, as riding three horses heading off in different directions, which I think it sort of encapsulates this idea of a split and decentered self. And I also see the subject as decentered in I think in Arguing Sainthood, and also in an article that I did, The Illusion of Wholeness, where I focused on the nature of the self as the core problematic. The subject shifts among inconsistent subject positions, imperfectly inhabiting possible and sometimes even impossible identities. In other words, I think of myself as a housewife, but I don't inhabit that identity very well. But at the same time, I think of myself as a speaker or as a professor. But that one's doesn't perfectly encapsulate who I am very well either. And in fact, when the two happen to occupy the same space at the same time, it creates issues. So that's kind of what I mean, or sort of simple example of that. So from that period, I was mentioning, just to go back to where I was, that period between writing the dissertation, getting a job, and writing the book, and these articles that I wrote. And there was really quite an extended series of articles, maybe about 10 articles or something. And the scariest to write and terrifying to publish, although not hard to publish in the sense that it was published right away, was Dreams from a Saint, Anthropological Atheism and the Temptation to Believe, which some of you may have read, which interestingly seems to be read more and more as time goes on. And just last night I was asked to speak in a class at the University of Florida where they had read Arguing Sainthood and Dreams from a Saint. And in this, I used my own dreams of Sufi saints, the saints that I had encountered in Pakistan, the peers, and reflecting on the effects of these dreams on others in that environment, but also on myself, to challenge the anthropological stance of neutrality. One of the interesting things about presenting or talking about this paper last night was that, and I reread it for that class, was that there's a certain dated quality about it. Yeah, it was written 25 years ago, so I would imagine. I'm dismayed that it feels a little dated, but of course not entirely surprised. And the dated quality was not the analysis, but rather the interlocutor that I had, in the sense that at the time, that stance of neutrality was far more dominant in anthropology and in across the disciplines than it is now. I mean, of course, we've had Said's Orientalism has penetrated academic thought in ways that it hadn't at the time, or was just beginning to penetrate. And the idea that we speak from a position of neutrality to begin with is something that most of us would not assume now. But otherwise, the other things that I was focusing on were how difficult it is to how that sort of secular self of the anthropologist and the taboo against going native. And I think that the phrase going native was the kind of, still, I think, holds a lot of stigma was something that I sort of painfully explored. Although I have to say the hardest part to write was in the dream the first dream that I described. The opening scene is my sister and I flying naked over a Victorian garden. And that was hard to write, but that would probably always be hard to write. But then I went back and I read that dream, and it was like, oh my God, this dream. I could spend another 10 pages analyzing this dream now from, with my new perspectives and stuff. So actually I got kind of fired up. I'm thinking, I've got to go back and, sort of re-examine it. So I'm excited to be able to do that. I think I really will go back to some of these examples.
Hattie, I have a question.
Yeah.
What? Something about the secular self of the anthropologist?
Say that again.
Can you say something more about the secular self of the anthropologist?
Okay. Yeah. So I think, and actually, this is something that has come up in this research project that I've been involved in the last few years on looking at religious change in Northwest Africa, Mauritania and Morocco and Senegal. And it involved hiring a team of mostly local researchers. And we really worked to have training sessions where we wanted to encourage people to conduct interviews that were more like conversations than the idea of an interview as just extracting information from people. And we wanted to encourage them to get people to tell stories and to really sort of participate in an interactive process. But this powerful idea of the researcher as the kind of neutral, objective scientist who is extracting information was so powerful that it was very hard to get the researchers to abandon that position. And the result, in many cases, we do have some really interesting material, but the result for most of the interviews was a bunch of information that was actually not very useful, because you could just turn to any history book or even newspaper article to get most of what they were saying at that level. And we were interested in this, how the sort of facts of history, like, oh, there was a riot over there, or so and so became president. I mean, real basic stuff. How it gets taken up into people's kind of personal sense of self and the past and the future. So that idea of neutrality is powerful, even when you move from the situation of the outsider anthropologist like me with my WASPy background, going off to a place like Pakistan. Even when you move to the very different positioning of people who are a part of the societies or were raised in the societies that they're working amongst, which was something that Lila Abu-Lughod talked about in her work on doing field work in Egypt. But I think the issue of neutrality, if anything, may be more powerful a constraint for people who have to kind of separate themselves at some level, to see themselves as professional and not just simply hanging out with the people they've always hung out with, or something like that. It's but I think it's an important issue to actually grapple with and really think about who one is and what's not as a person, not as these identities, but what identities you are actually projecting at that moment in the research process. and how that affects the interaction. Yeah. So does that address some of it anyway? I mean, I know you as a psychoanalyst are no doubt very sensitive to these issues, but
No, I was curious. Yeah,
yeah.
thanks. That was
I mean, so the idea of anthropologists also talk about participant observation, or what also has come to be called deep hanging out, as a way of, really getting to know people and all that, becoming friends with people. But there's also the countervailing ethical force of the IRB, the Institutional Review Board for Human Subjects, and somehow sort of, which assumes very much the distant researcher model, where somehow you have to protect human subjects by not asking them sensitive questions or revealing. I mean, there's a almost impossible tension between the methods of ethnographic methods of the anthropologist and other people in other disciplines now, and this model of research that requires a consideration of ethical concerns in ways that don't really fit the deep hanging out model. And I think so we're being forced into writing these IRB proposals. I know that Hillel, who I see is here, has been, just went through that horrific process. But really the model, I think ethics are of central concern. I want to emphasize that. But the model that we are being asked to follow in accounting for the ethics of our research are just totally incompatible with some of the best methods of anthropological research. And it distracts us from thinking about the ethical issues in other terms, which we need to do. So maybe I'll turn now to the book itself, and give you an idea of what I do in the book. And again, the structure of this class, more along the model that Rachel McDermott did in her class, which was to more kind of do little sections and then open it up for questions, and figure I'll kind of last through the whole session, but with the idea that we'll have conversations along the way. I think that's better than just doing this quick summary, which it's already too late for, and then just opening it up to a kind of a blank field. So I reiterate, please feel free to interrupt me along the way. So I'll turn now to Arguing Sainthood, which, by focusing on argument, carries a psychoanalytically informed perspective into ethnography. As I said, without psychoanalyzing my interlocutors. I mean, at times there are points, and what I'm going to do is describe the book in general and then turn to a specific scene that I didn't ask you to read. It's a scene from chapter 7, which was a chapter before the one that I asked you to read, to illustrate or raise the question, and actually I'd love to have you think about this with me, whether I do end up kind of psychoanalyzing one of my interlocutors. In this case, not the Kalunder that I was talking with, but rather my research assistant, whom I call Mumtaz. Because a lot of what I write about in that chapter is, in a sense, his struggle with dealing with these Kalunders. So anyway, I'll set that out there. So keep that in mind as I talk. So so I'm doing an ethnography that really focuses on the these kinds of conflicts, arguments, not only within the social world, but arguments that people seem to have with themselves. In other words, these inconsistencies that I've mentioned before. But I'm also concerned with history. In a sense, a history from the perspective of picking up traces of the past, traces of earlier arguments, whether they happened last year, or the last century, or in the earliest days of Islam, picking up these traces of the past in today's arguments and explicating these traces. So I use the Sufi pir, the Sufi saint. I translated as Sufi saint, which we all know is a terrible translation of the term pir, but yeah, so be it. Where multiple, and the Sufi pir, multiple discursive forces converge. So they are a focal point of argument. They're incredibly important to many people, and yet are also a focus of controversy and state policy, and play an important role in the conception of the Pakistani state, the identity of the Pakistani state, and so on. So I very much get into the political, not only in this book, but then in my more recent book, which you read the introduction of, Modern Sufis and the State, which is an edited volume done with Rosemary Corbett, who is also a graduate of the Columbia Religion Department. She graduated before I got there, but I ended up hiring her to work on the IRCPL project that this book emerges from. So we did that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the book. So part one focuses on the pir as a colonial construct. And especially chapter 2, I guess it is. And in chapter 3, the pir as a focal point for subject formation in the modern state. So I look at, for example, in chapter 2 at how the British separated the idea of the Sufi, the idea of the Sufi as a, or Sufi literature, the Sufi of old as the producer of this incredible poetry, the kind of Orientalist appreciation of Sufi tradition, completely separating that from the pir as a modern subject who is either a wandering beggar ascetic of ill repute, or a corrupt landowner who's in charge of a shrine or something like that, as an administrative problem for the British. So I go on about that and some of the ways that they characterize the pirs, and some of the traces we will see in some of what I talk about later, some of the traces of this policy. And then in chapter 2, the way that the Pakistani state, really under the guidance of the son of Muhammad Iqbal, the Pakistani poet and seen as the sort of founder of the idea of Pakistan. But his son sort of set out a policy for nationalizing the shrines and creating the Awqaf department to control them, and I analyze that in this process, and how they tried to modernize the practices at the shrines as part of this process to create the modern Pakistani citizen. So then in part 2 so that first part is mostly, although not exclusively, historical in the sense of I'm tracing stuff that happened, to set the scene in a sense. But it's not background. Something I advise my students, don't write a background chapter where you're just trying to present the facts as they were, you know, that to set the stage for whatever you're going to write about. Rather, they make, you know, very clear arguments of their own that I think are, and when I say set the stage, they lay out the terms of the current discourses that shape how people experience themselves today. Okay, so what I looked then in part 2 is turn to what could be called everyday arguments. I look at the ambivalent place of the peer in these everyday arguments, thinking about things like reformism versus Sufism, which was very much present when I was doing research. But these tensions did not exist in the way that they do today. This sort of Sufi solitude divide in global discourse was, it just didn't exist in the same way. But there were these various, you know, there were the Deobandis and the Barelvis and the Elayadis. They were there and arguing, very much so, but in ways that weren't yet taken up into this sort of policy discourses at an international level. We did have, I mean, it was certainly important in Pakistani politics. Maududi, who, you know, became an international influence, you know, his books having been translated into multiple languages and a tremendous influence on some of reformist thinking today. He was, you know, active politically with his party, the Jamaat-e-Islami, but, and I have to say that I actually interviewed him. So I did darshan to Maududi, which I think the idea of putting it in those terms would have horrified him, but and I encountered his followers at shrines, especially when I tried to talk to these Malang Kalundars. The Maududi people just hated that. I mean, it was like, you know, if you want to, you know, understand what Islam really is, you know, go talk to Maududi. And I said, I already did that. I did have a kind of rejoinder. But anyway, so there's sort of a new way that these splits have been taken up, and you know, especially because of things like 9/11 and some of the violence associated with shrines and such. Okay, so and here is where I actually do some analyses of how people shift positions as they talk about their neighbors, for example. Or I do one chapter where I actually look at Sufi Sab, who's the one that I introduced the book with as you know, kind of the first peer I met. Unexpectedly, I was doing research amongst housewives, I suppose you could call them, about, you know, just kind of how they saw themselves. And I wasn't even studying Sufism at the time, actually. I was researching notions of the self and walk into this. And actually I was talking with this woman, and she keeps saying, don't you want to meet my husband? Don't you want to talk to my husband? And I'm thinking, I'm talking to you, you know? And then we finally agreed. My research assistant, who was the woman who was in the family that I was living with, we finally went in, and there was this huge hall and all these people in front of this pier. And I could then understand why she was wondering why we're just there to talk to her. Anyway, so there was actually in Dreams from a Saint, I talked about this woman and this moment of meeting this peer who said he would come to me in a dream. And that night I had a dream of a white horse, a very vivid dream. I woke up startled in the night, and she was sleeping in the bed beside me and said, asked what it was. And I explained the dream, and she said, oh, he came to you in the dream. And she immediately wanted to go back and get some salt. He was distributing salt with blessings on it, and she wanted to get some salt to cure her brother, which to me was really surprising, because this was a family who was completely anti-peer. They did not visit peers. They were, kind of a reformist family in their orientation. And it's because I was working partly through them to meet these peers in the neighborhood that I ended up with so many arguments, because they would engage in arguments with the people that I was trying to interview, which seemed like a real disadvantage at the time. I'm thinking, why am I going around with people who don't agree with what I what these people are doing? But it turned out to be incredibly rich, because it became the basis for understanding what the tensions were and how people navigated these disagreements. Okay, so sorry, I kind of got off on that. But just say generally, and I won't talk about part 3 because I'm going to talk about that in more detail. But in the book, one could say that my goal was to situate my analyses within the life conditions of my interlocutors, while putting Islamic and psychoanalytic traditions into a kind of meditative dialogue as modes of inquiry into what Stefania Pandolfo recently has called journeys of the soul. And I mention that, or I quote her, because in some respects, I see arguing sainthood as a precursor of her recent book, Not of the Soul, which is set in Morocco. And one of the ways that, and doesn't focus exclusively on Sufism, it's more on madness and healing. But I see them as parallels and fairly rare, because of how they each bring anthropology, Islamic studies, and psychoanalysis into conversation. I mentioned in the beginning that the most psychoanalytic approaches to other societies, other cultures are really problematic. And the whole field of psychoanalytic anthropology, when I first was thinking about these things, was something I would just throw out the window. So I feel that, and I say a precursor because I wrote this one in 1997, and her book was just published in 2018, I think. So and the only other one I think that does something similar, which is to put psychoanalytic thinking into conversation with Islamic traditions and thinking within the Islamic tradition, rather than analyzing, put them into conversation rather than analyzing Islamic traditions in terms of psychoanalysis. The other one is El Shakri's book, recent book, The Arabic Freud. So I sort of feel like, and interestingly, I think my book is getting actually more play now. I think I have to admit, it was a bit ahead of its time in certain respects. And I think it gets more play now than it did back when it was first published. So, one might ask, why am I talking at such length about a book I wrote so long ago? But I do think that, and it's hard for me to assess because of course it's my book, but I really do feel like it has stuff to say now to an audience that can hear it now. So anyway, I'll stop there for a minute before I go on to think about Galanda's. David, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just unmic and ask questions.
And yet, okay. I was wondering just about this thing you just said about thinking within the Islamic tradition alongside psychoanalysis. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit, you know, in the beginning of Arguing Sainthood, you address part of, in the section we read, you address some of the sort of post-colonial theory claims about tradition and inside tradition and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering, you know, obviously both because you're an anthropologist and also because obviously you're in religious studies now, what it's like, what it was like, and sort of how you understand the idea of like operating within Islam as someone who, you know, isn't a Muslim from South Asia or what have you. Like, is that something that, you know, when you talk in those terms, is that something that people have ever addressed directly with you? Is that like, how was that received? How was that received then, and how is it received now?
Okay. Well, I, you know, of course, had talked a little bit earlier about my dreams from a saint, where I sort of played with like the temptation to believe as part of the title. I think, and actually Pandolfo herself doing a parallel thing, I think, I don't know, I had breakfast with her, and I'm pretty sure she said she'd converted to, yeah, she did say she'd converted to Islam, and has married a Muslim. And I'm on the outside in that sense, but very much on the fence, both then and now. And I think I might mention this, you probably can't see it, it's jewelry that I'm wearing today, which looks like a taviz, where you know, write verses of the Quran, and there, you know, this is like a good luck thing, except that it's empty. So am I just wearing a piece of jewelry, or am I wearing a taviz? To me, it's the Lacanian taviz, the sort of empty self at the heart of being, which, you know, has its parallels in religious traditions as well. So, okay, so there's that. I think that one doesn't actually have to be to do the intellectual move that I'm describing of writing within, writing seriously about how Muslims think about issues of the soul and the psyche. One can do that from the outside, in the sense that just as the anthropologist who aims to write, yeah, and I don't know that I can really answer your question, because I'm completely on the fence, as I was when I wrote the article, that I think one can think critically of the secular stance and just, you know, deconstruct it and say, yeah, there are limitations of assuming that there is nothing beyond a disenchanted world. And I would say that from that perspective, I write from within an enchanted world, how to put it in those terms. Or, you know, the emptiness within the taviz is not a secular emptiness, it's a space. And I think in that sense, one can, there's room to move, as opposed to simply writing about something that fundamentally is ontologically wrong, which is, I think, the stance that many anthropologists take, that we're writing about a system, a cultural system that's really interesting in its own terms and is meaningful to people, for the people that believe it. But of course, I'm writing as a non-believer. which is, I think, I'm not saying I am, but I'm saying that that's what anthropologists do. This was very explicit in Tanya Luhrmann's book about witchcraft in England, where she becomes initiated, full participant observation. But when she's writing the introduction of her book, she says, well, the basic question was, how could people who are just like me believe this stuff? Basically, she puts it a little more nicely than that, but that's the question she's asking. And then says, I am, of course, of writing from this position of neutrality, and I do not believe this stuff. It's like, well, no, you can't do that. And, ethically, I think. So that's a long, maybe not quite answer, but I think that seriously reflecting on the traditions, writing not just as if, writing because they have something true to say about the human condition, does not necessarily call for an identity claim as a Muslim to be able to do that.
Kathy, can I ask two questions? Sorry.
Yeah.
So question number one about Luhrmann. I mean, it seems surface obvious to me from a psychological standpoint that she's defensive, that probably she did find something there to believe, and her need to say, who on earth would believe this stuff, is defense.
Yeah.
Because as a middle-class subject herself in America, she can't say, oh man, these witches, they really have something.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that is that if we think back to the way, for example, that Carl Ernst has moved into thinking about Sufi practice today, where earlier the stuff that was associated with New Age movements was dismissed. We can't look at those Sufis because it's just New Age stuff, and we don't want to be contaminated. We are real scholars and don't want to be contaminated by all of these perversions of the tradition, as a kind of a defensive move that he is totally given up on now. I mean, now thinking about Sufism in the modern world is very much a part of his work. But it was interesting to see that transition. I think.
So my second question, and I'm sorry, it's a bad topic, but it has to do with identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times when I get asked, what are you doing? What do you study? Sufism. Are you Muslim? Right? And when you say no, from both interlocutors and other scholars, there's a suspicion. Why is this outsider studying this thing that belongs to us? So how does one position oneself in such a way that you are, okay, taking seriously what's being said by your interlocutor, but not converting, but also, it seems like a tricky dance.
It is a tricky dance. I don't have a good, a clear-cut answer. But I think seriously, being it, and again, the answer really depends, like every other conversation, on who you're speaking to and what they are doing by asking you the question. In other words, that question means different things depending on who's saying it in what context, and thus the answer will be different. And so I don't want to make any pronouncements about how you navigate that. I also, one of the things I wanted to reanalyze when I was rereading this article, Dreams from a Saint, last night, was a quote from one Sufi I worked with, and he said, "Oh, it's too bad you're not actually, you haven't found a master, that you're not actually a follower." He said, and he drew the contrast between, it's like drinking Coke instead of champagne. And at the time, I got the image, but now reading it, I'm thinking, and champagne is forbidden. So I thought there are other layers of meaning to this analogy that I need to unpack. But yeah, so I think it is a tricky dance. And I think it really, this is why it's so important to not just, sort of listen to the words, but to attend to the multiple things that somebody is doing by asking the question in the first place. And that those things will be different depending on the moment. And this is above all what I do in my work, is to get at those things. So, when I'm asked, are you a Muslim? Well, it depends on what you mean. I have not converted to Islam, no, but whatever that might mean, and how one might do that specifically in what environment and that. But in terms of the impact of Islam on my life, well, it's obviously been central.
Could I ask a question? Because it's kind of related.
Yeah.
So I was just going to ask if you have any theories as to why it is over the course of your career you've managed to avoid controversy. So many other people have tried and failed to use psychoanalytic methods and interpretation elegantly and have gotten in trouble. Forget about psychoanalysis. There's all kinds of, we can say, oh, any reasonable person reading this academic work will see what the argument is. But especially in South Asia, and in India in particular, lots of scholars' work have been misinterpreted, have been taken out of context, anything. What even jogged my mind when I thought of this is at the very beginning, you were talking about anthropological models of culture as having a bounded identity. And even today, the idea that, that seems to have political entanglements, even to say that certain communities don't have a coherent, durable identity, even seems to court a little bit of controversy in particular political context. You've avoided this, and so many others have not. I'm curious to know if you have any theories as to why you've managed to, avoid your dream your temptation to believe. That is people love that article. You think, oh, this is going to be really controversial, and instead it has the opposite effect you fear. I'm just curious what you think.
Well, one of the controversies that we've talked about before, and I think of is Jeffrey Kripal's psychoanalytic study of Ramakrishna, and I feel that one was so controversial because it does exactly what I try not to do with psychoanalysis, which is to explain conflict or sort of personal conflicts or personal motivations in terms of sex, in a kind of, oh yeah, there were sort of sexual almost deviations that happen in childhood that explain a certain kind of adult stance. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, and I think that his book, even though it at some level claims not to, or Wendy Doniger in her introduction claims that it doesn't do that, it doesn't. And so that's one reason. It's the other possibility is that I actually, for personal and political reasons, not having to do with personal controversy, but my own, life, and I also managed, we never mentioned in our academic biographies our personal lives much, but I also managed to raise 3 children along the way. So I was kind of busy with that during those years that I did not go back to Pakistan. And so perhaps not going back to Pakistan kind of minimized the controversy there. I'm not sure. Although I did learn the first time I went back to Pakistan, back before I wrote the book, was when I realized that the writings you do have an effect. I think the model in anthropology when I first was working was, you know, we write about the natives and they're illiterate and they don't see what you write. You just write about these cultures. And of course, that's completely irrelevant now. But, you know, it was a shock when I went back to Pakistan and went to talk with this, you know, educated man who was also very involved in Sufism. And, you know, he started talking about this article I'd written. And I was like, you've read my article? You know, such a shock. And actually with this book, there is some controversy. So, you know, I have this picture on, I don't know if you can see it, the cover of my book. And that woman in the background, turns out was something of a controversial figure. This was a picture I took when I interviewed somebody who I don't even actually write about in this book. I write about him in some other articles, but Sufi Barakat Ali, who has actually become a rather big figure, who died and, you know, has a big following, especially in England and also a following in the United States. And I won't go into that in detail, but this woman was, I thought was just his daughter, but actually she sort of came to live with him or in the compound. And I don't know the circumstances, but, you know, that was controversial. Kind of like Maududi and what's her name? Jamila, getting her last name. This American who went to live, you know, and study with Maududi. But anyway, and then she went into total seclusion. And so having a photograph of her on the cover of my book stirred huge distress amongst her family in subsequent years, like now. So we're talking about, this book was published in 97. The photograph was taken in 1976. And now in the last year, I'm experiencing controversy about the cover of this book. And I'm not quite sure what to do about it. But so that's not like there's no controversy, but it's not exactly about the writing itself. And this, you know, comes to, and she obviously posed for the photograph at the time. So what do you do when, you know, conditions change? But I don't know why, maybe, I don't know why I haven't, you know, experienced what other people have. Maybe because also I turned away to write about, you know, after writing this book and, you know, with all these family issues and having all these kids and a husband who found it difficult to frame he wanted to do a research, Tom wanted to do a research project on, based on census data in Pakistan, because he's a quantitative sociologist. And he found the census data and, you know, the data sets, he just couldn't get the kind of material when we went once, he couldn't get the kind of material he would need to do that research. So we decided to go someplace where we could both work. And that's why we ended up going to Germany. And I did fieldwork amongst Turks in Germany and wrote the book Stolen Honor, Stigmatizing Muslim Men in Berlin, which really unpacked public discourse in Germany and, you know, upset some Germans, but not enough to create, you know, huge controversy or anything. So
actually, I may have an answer to that, at least I think.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not the good one to answer that question, actually. Yeah.
I think this is also the similar reason why Nandi is, invites a lot of problem for other reasons, but not his use of psychoanalysis. It's because he's interested, and I think that is what Kathy's book does. It's interested in the larger theme or the premise of psychoanalysis as a theory of human subjectivity. And I think they're more interested in talking about the making of subjecthood, the conflicts around it, mourning, loss, trauma, than getting into what I would call the superficial, tantalizing, Oedipus and sex and like mommy and daddy. I mean, these are really important, and we don't even use it in like clinical work, actually, to be honest.
Yeah.
But because they are the ones that actually get people going, because at the end of the day, you can only make such interpretations when you're actually talking to the person.
Mm.
And to make the kind of interpretation about cultures, it's not just difficult, it's also demeaning. So to avoid that, I think that's what both Kathy and Nandi in another context have been able to do, that they've been able to capture like a fragment of what psychoanalysis does almost therapeutically and not theoretically.
Mm.
I think that is why the psychoanalytical bit, which can create all kind of upstaging in South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India in that respect, hasn't really come their way, because they're not saying that, oh, beneath this is sex.
Right.
I think that is what also that's why they also sell the point of human subjectivity. That's what at least I think.
Yeah. And the funny thing about saying beneath it all is sex is a very Victorian thing as well, because you know, it was sex that the thing that the British were most upset about. I mean, they were, you know, and homosexuality and all that stuff. They were, you know, putting people in, you know, on trial for, you know, same-sex relations, and I think that you know, a sort of Victorian approach to sex, which Foucault says was basically magnifying the issue of sex, in turn has shaped the perception. Here's where we get the kind of colonial influence on today's practices, like the how Ramakrishna is perceived today in the Ramakrishna mission, for example, emphasizes certain aspects of his teachings and downplays other aspects as much as possible. You know, that he's you know, the sort of the really philosophical, sort of abstract philosophical stuff, rather than his image of, at one point, saying he was covered with vaginas, you know, as an image that he used in one of his states. You know, that's not the stuff that the Ramakrishna mission wants to publicize in public discourse in a way that's influenced by certain understandings of and certain organizations of sex coming out of that late 19th century moment. So, and Freud, of course, you know, his preoccupation with sex was coming out of that same moment. So, and this is one of the interesting things, I don't want to go too far into this, but Lacan is interesting because he also grounds his thinking in some sense in terms of sexual difference, but sexual difference is among a gap, not a childhood preoccupation carried into adulthood. It's a very different way of putting it into one's model. And I'm right now seriously dealing with this issue. So I haven't just set aside the problem of sex. In fact, it's moving into my work more centrally now, ironically. In the current project that I've been working on for far too long, I'll mention the title of that just so you give it some context. It's called Free to Choose, tentatively called Free to Choose, Sex Change, Gender Ambiguity, and the Modern Middle Class in Kolkata. That, you know, focuses really on sex change surgery. So it's, you know, sex is at the heart of it. But again, not doing a psychoanalysis of people who go through sex change surgery, but using this phenomenon to really think about this problem of the place of sex in psychoanalysis. I think, and in, I mean, beyond psychoanalysis, the place of sex in our world. And so I don't want to say, oh yeah, I just sort of shifted to, and this is the move, the way you described it, Sarah, is the way, what I did at first. Okay, let's set this sort of childhood desires and sex aside. It's not doing me or anybody else any good in terms of using it in psychoanalysis. But now I'm sorry, I'm being scam bombed these days. Anyway, so now I think, having set it aside, worked through a bunch of stuff, now I'm turning back to focusing full force on this problem, this theoretical problem of.
Can I just ask you? Can I just ask you something quickly? Just like at this moment when like the notions of sex, sexuality, being transgender, all these notions of sex are just changing so rapidly, and it's like doing a project. I mean, it takes so much time, and you have to, like, it's hard to grasp at the moment. It happens with me when I'm talking about, issues of race, of visibility, of publicness. Now, like at this particular moment, like every few days, every few minutes, like concepts are starting to change. So I was just wondering how you've been, how you're managing to catch up with that, or what role does that play in the current research? Sorry, I know this is a tangent, but.
Well, no, I mean, that's, since I did jump to this this more recent concern, I think, I mean, what I want to do then is, at least right now, the way I think about it is that a lot of the kind of politics of sex, sex is of course now very public and visible, quite the opposite of kind of what Foucault was describing for the late 19th century, where it was ostensibly invisible, even though it was sort of running the show, and control of sex was running the show. Now we've had, what I see in current discourse is an inversion of that process. So we had, certain categorizations of sexuality and sex in terms of, that is embodied in like the LGBT, these sort of identity markers that are used to describe the phenomenon itself. But it's an inversion of an existing discourse. It's not exactly a move away from it. And so thinking about the effects of this discourse and the structure of this discourse in terms of a phenomenon like sex, sexual difference, really, in this particular place, time and place, Kolkata now, is a way of thinking of the problem of what sex means. And so in this project, I do something, it sounds like a shift at some level, but what I'm doing is something analogous to what I developed in Arguing Sainthood, in the sense that I'm thinking about a current problem and how it plays out in the lives of particular people, and based on partly on fieldwork amongst people who went through the surgery in Calcutta. And then looking at the kind of historical matrix out of which this particular situation emerges. And Kolkata is a really interesting place to do this, because it was the focal point of British colonialism and the establishment of colonialism in India. And so there was a really interesting kind of gendering of the colonial relationship, where you have the effeminate Bengali man, who's seen as, sort of effeminate, as sort of the conquered woman, and the masculine colonizer, and that sort of plays out in fairly elaborate ways. And then you have that resting on top of a devotional tradition where you have the sort of medieval figure, Chaitanya, who was sort of a central figure in the Bhakti movement, who was seen in some versions of tradition, and very much, sort of an important image of Chaitanya as being an embodiment of both Radha and Krishna. So you have a sort of a different approach to sexual difference and its relationship to love and devotion in that image. And then, sort of moving forward to Ramakrishna, who was at the heart of this colonial process in the late 19th century, who himself sort of played with gender in interesting ways. And then, but with, as I mentioned earlier, the Ramakrishna mission, in part because of this colonial perspective, really kind of tamping it down. And then on top of that, you have the rise of psychoanalysis in India, right there, at within the same general time frame. So we have that, and then today, well, I got into the project, just to give you a touch of background, because my co-author, Boishaki Taylor, who was a colleague at Duke, and is now has a big administrative position at Smith College that she just took. But within her family, there were two people close to the family who went through this surgery. One at a time when, so somebody she knew as a child, at a time when this was really, not a common practice. And he ended up committing, or she ended up committing suicide because the conditions were so difficult. And then a more recent person who's was a friend of the family, a close friend of her aunt's, who lives in the same house with her, who went through the surgery more recently and has now become a major public figure in advocating for transgender rights. And so we, sort of had conversations with her over several years, watching her move into this public position. And then as I was in the midst of this research, the filmmaker Ritu Panu Ghosh did a film called Chitrangada, which kind of encapsulates it all, and is basically, he plays the main character who is going through, trying to decide whether to complete sex change surgery. As I sometimes crudely put it, he's done the top, and he's trying to decide whether to have his penis cut off, is sort of what the whole movie's about. And this indecision, and I would, one of the things I see it as is kind of the modern Hamlet, the sort of to do or not to do. And so all of this comes together in this place. And so that's what I see the book as really addressing these sort of issues of the sort of ethnography, history, in this case not Islamic studies, but very much the kind of the religious tradition out of which some of these figures are operating, and then very much the controversial politics of even saying anything in this context about Ramakrishna. I think, to respond to Quinn's question, I may have dodged controversy so far, but I probably won't with this book. And it's been difficult to write, partly because I had begun, or I was just finishing up the field work when I got to Columbia in 2011. And then, was confronted with all of these experts on Bengal, all the people you've met so far in this course, for example. And, Rachel's sitting here listening to me at the moment. And it was, and a wonderful education in trying to figure out how to think about this material. And it's been amazing, being here in this environment. But needless to say, also very daunting. And it's taken a long time to feel really ready to take the plunge. I've written a few things, published a few things, but to really actually get the book on paper has been, not paper, on the computer, has been difficult. But it's coming. I really feel like the kinds of conversations I've had in the last few years, including with people that I've had, graduate students, and I've had kind of sort of supervisory role with postdocs, including Mohammed is here right now, and then and Rajbir Judge, who some of you may have had a course with. We were thinking about psychoanalytic theory, Lacan, and some of the work on sex that have been also very influential in helping to deepen my thinking. And if I were to go back to arguing sainthood, I would feel like it would have benefited from being here, certainly with talking to some of the people I seem to criticize in the introduction to Arguing Sainthood. And I wish I had been here in conversation with people like Gayatri Spivak and Partha Chatterjee and all, to sort of deepen my perspective then. But this book will benefit from being here. So I'm really excited about it, and sort of trying to clear a few more things off my plate to really take off on the writing.
I just have a quick comment about our discussion. I think Jennifer Finchie recently wrote a book about the British colonial policy of policing gender, where the Criminal Tribes Act of the 1870s criminalized third gender and Hijra communities. So I think she really presents this idea of the gender binary as a colonial episteme in and of itself. So I think we can connect this need for a sex change operation in relation to modernity that's shaped on the terms of European colonialism. So I think that's really helpful for us to think about, because again, if we think about the gender binary as an colonial imposition, then this idea, we can kind of engage with this idea of gender non-conformity as something that's not engaging with these colonial discourses and their remainders in the post-colonial states. And we're really seeing this now in Pakistan with the Khawaja Siras, who are now advocating for their rights on a basis of a shared collective history of the Mughal Empire and their role in the Mughal Empire as advisors, as very respected people. So I think instead of cross-dressing or these types of terminology that really focus on centering the gender binary and don't really question the gender binary as a discourse in and of itself, I think gender nonconformity allows for that space. So I just wanted to share that idea and just what Hinchi's book and also what's recently going on in Pakistan. Because a lot of moves have been made.
Right. And I've been thinking about that. Thanks for that, those suggestions. These are some of the things that I'm really thinking about centrally. And actually, as a kind of warm up to getting back into actually writing on the book, I did an article. I was in Paris in the spring, but only for 2 months because of COVID. And during that time, just to kind of get me going into back to working on the book, I did an article called Embodied Metaphor, Playing with Gender in South Asian Sufism, where I went back to somebody I had met during fieldwork and who was dressed as a woman, and used it to think about these issues of sort of thinking about sexual difference in other ways. And I think really very much along the lines of what you're talking about. It's like, we just have to step outside of these categories that shape, that, as you said, create the need for something like surgery, because these identity categories create kind of dissonance. They create different forms of desire that that lead us to think that having surgery makes sense. Now, you know, I think you'll maybe hear in my saying that the controversies that I step into by even taking that position, because it very much, there's a very powerful political movement, you know, that's where some people would say I'm somehow trying to undercut the you know, sort of the possibilities, you know, the open possibilities of going through sex change surgery and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, the term gender nonconformity maybe is a way of dodging the discourse. I'm not sure. I have to see what the effects of doing this writing are going to be.
I felt like your analysis of signification and embodied metaphor was really helpful, because I think it really helped me think of normative gender as a rubric in and of itself, like a signification rubric. So we can think of non-normative gender as other forms of signification that may be external to these rubrics. Because again, I mean, this was the colonial project of going to these places, establishing rubrics of legitimacy and normativity, as you know, to really empower the colonial subjects from this perspective of a Western, in many ways, white supremacist discourse. So yeah, I think, yeah, just signification also is really helpful.
Well, I'm hoping that's what I felt. I needed to warm up, partly by dealing with material that was more familiar to me, and I would be at least seen as an expert on the material itself, as opposed to plunging in this area where I am not. And in fact, I'm looking at Rachel because I'm thinking of an answer to a question that I posed in our last session with her, where, you know, I asked, you know, why you weren't pursuing the you know, this diasporic community more, and, you know, actually turning it into a book based on that wonderful article. And you said, because you don't know the language. Well, you know, that's sort of an indictment of this whole project at some level. Because, yeah, I went to Bengal. I thought, oh, I'll learn Bengali while I'm there. My daughter and I were doing Bengali classes, and these words, and it was, you know, actually speak Bengali, and I'm like getting the words from, you know, one day to the next. At my age, it's very hard to learn new languages, I admit. So, you know, and that's part of the nervousness about doing it too. But I hope that I have something to say that that goes beyond, you know, that, and I will miss stuff. I won't be able to do, and this has been a you know, a tension in doing this project, is that the kind of research I like to do, the kind of sort of intimate interactions where I am listening for subtlety and nuance, you know, I can't do in the same way I did in Pakistan. Although even in Pakistan, you know, there was always a language barrier. And I think even Jack Hawley complains about the language barrier with his Hindi, doing the field work that he was doing. It's not, you know, my Urdu is far from native, and besides, people spoke Punjabi. You know, there's always a barrier, which is why in most of the more interesting interactions I had, there was usually like a member of the family was with me. And so in this project, I've kind of, you know, sort of done that, used that same strategy, but even more so in that Boishaki is, you know, sort of intimately connected through family connections with some of the people and some of the concerns that we're dealing with. And And then some of the work is on a film. So of course I can watch the film, although it does involve subtitles to really absorb it. But, Boishaki and I go through it together and try to, understand some of the nuances that I might miss. And it's just what I found didn't work very well was that research model that I described to you for the Northwest Africa project. I will never do that again. We will have hopefully an interesting collection of essays coming out of it, but I do feel like it misses what I was trying to get out of it. But in my work in Kolkata, working closely with Boishaki, and are sort of doing interviews over many years, I think has allowed me not to be perfect, but I'm never going to really fully know the people that I work with. But it's allowed me to have something to say that I feel is informed by speaking with other experts, by bringing the kind of knowledge that I've developed over a career that's far too long. In other words, I'm getting old, but that I will have something to say. I think that's really what I'm going for here. So I was going to give you an example from the calendars, which I would love to do, but I think they're really, I'd rather hear your thoughts and reactions and questions than sort of talk anymore. And I really appreciate your questions along the way as well. Any other? Oh, you have to ask to unmute. It says, hello, it says ask to unmute. I don't know what to do.
Who you're trying to unmute?
Hello. I don't know.
I'm unmuted now.
Okay. Yeah. Did you want to ask a question?
Oh, no, sorry. I didn't ask to unmute. Sorry. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay. Let me just stop this. Okay. Sorry, I should have turned off the whole phone, but so other thought? If not, I'm happy to give you this example from the calendars. I should also let me just mention one thing that I forgot to mention is that the two calendar chapters, one of which I asked you to read, were really important for thinking about sort of the limits of social or discursive order, and they were extremely important. And then as I moved into that recent article that's forthcoming, because these calendars do sort of think reflexively, they open up the space of the possibility of thinking of the arbitrariness of culture, really. And so I think are sort of a disruption of certain assumptions that were common back when I was starting, that again are not so common now. But the idea that it was the move into modernity that allows a kind of reflection and critical thinking and distance from one's own culture. And one of the things that the book Arguing Sainthood tried to do was to disrupt that assumption of a rupture, which was based in part on the idea that somehow there was a fullness to tradition, that people were just fully inhabiting tradition and not stepping back from it. But what I wanted to mention is that, so then recently with Ilana Gerbacher, who's with us in my upper right-hand corner, we co-authored an article. I wrote down the name so I would have it. Where is it? that was for the Routledge Handbook of Sufism, where we revisited the calendar issue and sort of did a discussion. Oh, it's called The Calendaria, From the Mosque to the Ruin in Poetry, Place, and Practice, which really got me going again with the calendars, which has then led to me to think about them again in embodied metaphor. And then I also wanted to mention Khadija. You want to wave, Khadija? Who is also interested in, another of my PhD students who is interested in pursuing the issue of the modern calendar in Pakistan. So I think in a way that I sort of had an idea about back when I was writing the book, but in ways that maybe even go beyond, it sort of hooks in theoretically to things that I wasn't even aware of back then. So I'm really excited about all this stuff. Are there questions? If not,
yeah,
yes.
Dreams. I guess with Dreams of a Saint, you mentioned that parts of it were outdated, and you'd like to, and you were rethinking about it, and would like to revisit. If you were to write about those experiences now, if those experiences were happening to you, let's say now, how would you have written about them? How would you write about them differently?
Well, I think that there were sort of two separate issues. One is that I wouldn't frame it so much. I mean, the framing in terms of current thinking in the discipline, I would have to do differently because of, and trace some of the sort of moves that have been made to sort of question the objectivity of the researcher. So actually, I feel like that part would be less of a contribution now than it was then. But I would use the dreams more to unpack. When I read the dreams, they had this tremendous impact on me that made me realize that what they did could be explicated even more. And maybe just in terms of my own desires. I would go further, I think, with the positioning, my own positioning, not to criticize the discipline so much as to use it as a vehicle to explore the problematic itself more. I think some of the things that I was trying to express in responding to some of your questions, perhaps, that I've taken my thinking further on this problem of my relationship with Sufism, which I kind of then, well, I mean, the dream ends where I'm sort of trying to come up with names for my son, my non-existent son, that sort of link with the real world. It's like there's this pain of this woman in the other room who is saying something in her sleep, and that becomes the name that I'm trying to identify in the dream as I gradually wake up. And I would really explore that moment of the conjunction of the real world and my dream world, and what that means. That it was, I think my conscious mind would have known that it was a woman, my host, moaning in pain, but in my dream it becomes the name of my non-existent son. And I just think that would open up a huge amount without merely becoming my own personal journey. I mean, I think that it would have a lot to say about how I think as an outsider about my relationship to the discipline and to Sufism.
Oh, sorry, Kathy, can I follow up on the idea of a dream world?
Yeah.
So, one of my chapters is going to be on the space of dreams in like the Sufi imaginary. And you just said dream world as though it's an actual, like for you, what is the I don't know, ontological status of the dream space? Is it another space that you went to, another way of being that you inhabited?
I don't know. And is it, I mean, the whole struggle I had, and I think I write about this in that article, is between a reductively psychoanalytic idea of dreams as pointing to the past, of unresolved conflict from the past, and ultimately, down to the sort of the drive and the sexual conflict, versus something that was happened in sort of the phenomenologists of dreaming, like Binswanger, and then Foucault. As I say in the article, I think Foucault, before he was Foucault, wrote about Binswanger's existential sort of phenomenological approach to dreams, where the kernel of the dream is a sort of a looking forward as a kind of creativity, and sort of the freedom of the human subject. So how do I think of dreams? Yeah, I mean, I think of them as very much a place I like to go to if I can fall asleep at night. So yeah, it is. I go to sort of lie down and think, oh yeah, where was I when I was last with my head on the pillow? And it's almost always lately places that are familiar and yet not home, like other countries. I mean, I do a lot of world traveling in my dreams, but I'm always kind of lost or can't get back to where I need to be. So, yeah. So I suppose that they were different then. I mean, dreaming of. I think that the structure of my dreams today was very much shaped by my fieldwork experience back in my 20s. But there were the Sufis in my dreams occasionally then. And I don't know that I've had a Sufi in my dream lately. I have instead the sort of empty tavis. But I've come back. I mean, that's the other thing, in terms of my life trajectory, I've really returned to thinking about stuff, thinking about Sufism, thinking about psychoanalysis. I actually had, wasn't thinking about psychoanalysis for many years either. I was doing, much more kind of public discourse, political thinking. And I've really come back to that, and it's kind of opened up a kind of mental space. I remember feeling that kind of crust over, use a kind of psychoanalytic clinical image, that's like the crust of everyday life. And now that's starting to open up, and it is a space of creativity and excitement. Even though I'm sitting, and maybe it's possible because of COVID, I'm sitting here in Sag Harbor. I, only go out for walks, in the woods and along, quiet streets. Never socially interacting with people except my family from time to time. So it's an exciting time, even though I'm so, sort of late in my career. I feel like it's just beginning in certain ways.
So going to the Binswanger, so it sounds like Freud is saying there's a kernel of the dream that goes back to sex. And Binswanger is saying there's a kernel of the dream that's a looking forward. I'm wondering, just thinking about your dreams of a saint, you don't come out and say this, but I wonder if you would say there's a kernel of a dream, of a certain kind of dream that's interrelational, that when we see or speak to people in dreams, that's an ontologically real relationship that's happening in the dream space.
I would kind of say so, in the sense that then those dreams really affect how you act in the real world. So they are create, and interactions are a space that's created between you or amongst you. And therefore they are just as imaginary in a way, or imagined, I should say, as what happens in the dream. And then there's the weird times when my husband and I have almost the same dream, and it's like, well, okay, how did that happen? That's another story.
As far as the interactions between dreams go, I certainly say Naqshbandis would certainly agree.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, yeah, within, and this gets to the problem of belief again. So within Sufi circles, you hear, communication with dreams. What do I think about that? Is that possible? I also live in a world where when I am thinking about Sufism and involved, even in the academic ways that I am, I have Sufi moments, what I call Sufi moments, which are just ridiculous coincidences and things, which one could explain away, but why do they feel, my husband, a statistician, would say, oh, you can think about the statistics and stuff, but why do they happen, in ways that are so, powerfully impactful, where you run into somebody or, I don't know. I can think of a couple specific ones right now, but they're just like, we go through life, this incredibly complex world where, billions of people, and yet we are able to live a life that seems like we're the center of it in a way that things happen for us to create a meaningful life. And that's pretty amazing, actually, that we live in such a complicated world. Even Trump likes to, it feels that, the chips fall his way all the time, so, and he's been able to shape the world to his sense of self. But we all do that. It's to some, not at the scale that he does, but I think we all are, do that. And how do we do that? It's really amazing. Anyway, I'm over time. I want to thank you all for your really stimulating questions. It's really been fun to talk with you. And
this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And as you know, very relevant to all my stuff. So thank you. And yes, the RB was a nightmare.
Yeah, I know. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.